This podcast is a member of the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network. Visit voicesofwrestling.com to hear the rest of our great podcasts, as well as show reviews, columns, opinions, and updates across the world of wrestling.
Hello there, everybody. It's me, Garrett Kidney, the co-host of You've Got to Be Kidding Me on the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network.
And I am Liam Jones, my full name, and I'm also a part of the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network as a co-host for You've Got to Be Kidding Me.
We are a TNA history podcast that covers TNA 1 month at a time. We cover all the drama, all the matches, all the Vince Russo nonsense you could ever want in your life.
Have you heard of TNA? I bet you have, but would it be funnier if two people made jokes over it the whole time? Probably.
So if that sounds like fun to you, check it out on this very Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network, and Liam will do bits and whatnot.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am your host, as always, Jesse Collings, and joining me today, first-time guests on the show, but I'm sure many people are familiar with his work. He is the host of, or one of the hosts of the Between the Sheets podcast. He also has his own Substack, Babyface v Heel. He's been around the wrestling scene and wrestling media for pretty much as long as almost anybody else in this space. Not to out you for your age, but it's David Bixenspan. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I don't know if I would go that far. I mean, of the newer generation, yes.
I would say like the social media era.
Yes. I've been
this thing. Obviously, there's Dave and Wade and those people that have been decades and decades. But in terms of like being a presence in the social media age of wrestling media, which is really how I was introduced, I feel like you've been as long as established as pretty much anyone else.
Yeah, I guess so.
Can I ask you?
Go ahead.
Can I ask you something? When did you become Bix? Like, is that like what stage of your life where you just start going by Bix?
I never asked for it. It did start in childhood as a nickname, and then other people just started calling me it online. I mean, part of it did start online was with my original handle was because I was and still is to a degree a big McFoley fan, was Cactus Bix. So that eventually morphed into online just being Bix. But I mean, honestly, sometimes I kind of prefer it for people to just call me David at this point. But I'm not going to be insistent about it, I guess.
Yeah, because to me, when I think about you or I see you, I'm like, oh, it's Bix. But I'm curious to know, like, there's something about like people that have like, I don't know, like certain first syllables in their last names that just becomes adopted. I'm just kind of interested like in the cultural phonetics of how that has happened to you and other people with different last names, because it's like semi-common. Like no one calls me Call. Like that just sounds stupid. Right? But I'm like, Bix, it's just perfect. I don't know if it's the X sound at the end of your first syllable of your last name.
I think that's part of it. Yes.
Yeah. And it's not, or if you had like a really complicated first name that people didn't know how to pronounce, which is not true, people could just adopt to it. But I just think of you as Bix. But I can call you David on this pod.
Yes,
David's
that would be fine.
David is my father's name. It's my middle name. This is a podcast that respects the name David, so we can call that. Anyway, the reason David is here, okay, that just sounds wrong. The reason Bix is here on the show is
you know what it is? If you're addressing me like indirect, if you're addressing me, David sounds better. If you're talking about me for some reason, it seems like Bix sounds better.
Yeah. If I was, reading off, you had an order at Starbucks and the name on your coffee cup was David, I would say David. But the reason you, sir, are on the show today is because we're talking about the Vince McMahon documentary. Now, I will say that when this, in the build up to this documentary coming out, and really when the documentary first came out, my personal interest level was pretty low. And I was like, I don't have time to watch this 6-part Netflix documentary. I don't care about, I'm kind of Vinced out. We just spent so much time talking and reading and writing about Vince McMahon over the years, especially this last year and a half, that I don't really have a lot of interest in watching this 6-part documentary series. And like a lot of people, I figured I pretty much knew everything that they were going to go over. It wasn't a documentary that was aimed at people like me. But right when the documentary came out and kind of I saw the first few reactions online, I realized that, this is really this is going to end up being like one of the most important wrestling stories of the year, if you can call it that. We're probably going to be referencing content from this documentary for quite a long period of time. And it is an extremely relevant wrestling story. So I felt like I was obligated to watch it and share my thoughts and opinions on it. And obviously, um, I know that you've been following this closely, and you've have you seen the complete
Yes.
series? Yes. Okay, so I have as well. Um, I wouldn't say it was easy to watch it all in the short period of time, but um, I think you'd be a great person to discuss it. And I guess I'll just start with this. What is your general, like, bite-sized takeaway from the documentary? We'll get into all the details throughout this show, but I'm just curious to know, like, what was your like when you wrapped up episode 6, assuming you watched it in linear order, what was kind of your takeaway from it?
I watched it in mostly linear order. I jumped straight to the Titan Gate stuff from
Mhm.
'92 in episode 2, then just kind of let it play the rest of the way through, and then caught up on the first episode and the beginning of the second episode after. So I basically watched it in order. Elevator version of what I thought, I think it boils down to a few things. One is just that the construction is very uneven, to the point I feel like watching it, I got the feeling that the middle episodes, 2 through 5, were made with kind of a different goal in mind, and 1 and 6 were kind of more thrown together after the more recent scandals broke, but that they didn't really go back and adjust some of the tone to fit the bookend episodes. So I would say that. I would say that, it's very well put together in terms of editing and the use of archival footage and whatnot. So I would say that. But overall, like, my takeaway is, like, should people watch it? Yes, but, like, even though I've heard, from non-fans and people who watch it with non-fans that liked it, it's not that well made for non-fans, because there's not a lot of why there. It's very, throughout the whole 6 hours, it's very, this happened and then this happened, and oh, this also happened.
Right, and I think that, I mean, I have heard, I see right now, just assuming, I don't know how accurate this is. It is number 3 in the U.S. for TV shows on Netflix. Um, Number 1 is the show Monsters, which is about the Lyle and Eric Menendez story, which is like the Netflix's own, like, competitive, like, um series covering a famous scandal, I guess. That I don't know if that came out the same time as the Mr. McMahon series, but that's essentially it. I thought that was kind of interesting, but I haven't really heard a ton of, like, outside of the wrestling bubble people watching this.
I mean, it review wise, the only people, as far as I could tell, that reviewed it, even at mainstream outlets, were hardcore wrestling fans.
Yeah,
You know,
people that
with
had written about wrestling before.
yeah, with Garrett Martin at Paste Magazine, I guess, being the most obvious one, because he's someone that we all know personally and interact with on Twitter. So it seems like there was zero buy-in from your mainstream critics. The Alan Sepinwalls, Daniel Feinbergs of the world were not reviewing this in advance, and it seems like people are watching it. Where are you seeing the ranking? Because at least on their website, it only has through last week.
Yeah, I don't know. I just, when I go on Netflix and you go and browse, I scroll down, it says like top 10 TV shows
Oh,
in the
not the
US today.
actual ranking page.
No,
The way it's
this is
displayed in the actual user interface. Okay.
yeah, this is, and it has, like, again, like, who knows how accurate these actually are? Who knows how accurate, like, Netflix, like, metrics even are? Um, so I'm not even
But
looking at the actual
it's
rankings.
ahead of the Ellen special, which is one of the biggest things of the week. The Ellen DeGeneres stand-up special, which just came out.
Yeah, I guess I didn't. So the only, out of this top 5 I'm looking at, the only one that I had even heard of and I'm not like a super plugged in TV person, and I'm not always on Netflix. Like the only other one I've ever heard of is the Lyle and Eric Menendez show.
I've heard the name Emily in Paris too, but I don't really know
Looking
anything
at
about it.
Nobody Wants This. That's number 2. I don't know what that is. It appears to be a comedy, maybe based off
Yeah.
maybe a
And to be
rom-com.
clear, this is the U.S. list.
Yeah,
Just
I'm
to-
looking at the U.S. list. Looks like there's something called The Perfect Couple. It looks like is that Liev Schreiber? Is something like this is terrible analysis. I'm just looking at
No, I
these
don't, but
things.
it clearly it is doing well with the Netflix audience right now. And we'll have more hard numbers next week when they post the actual rankings. Like
I
looking
haven't
at
come.
go ahead.
I was just saying I haven't come across anyone in my personal life that is like, "Hey, have you checked out the Vince McMahon docuseries yet?" And people will do that. I'm sure, like just like with you, people that know they're a wrestling fan will like, "Oh,
Yeah.
even if they haven't watched it, they might mention it." I have not had that yet, so.
Yeah, I haven't yet. I suspect my parents might watch it because they've gotten very into watching Dark Side of the Ring reruns and the other Dark Side shows on Vice lately, because they're, for those who don't know, like, with the like live premiere ratings of Dark Side of the Ring have never really been representative, because those things, not just the week of, but like long term, get replayed all the time.
Yeah, don't they
Like
go
the
on
top,
YouTube? Like the full episodes on YouTube?
usually just like the first episode of the
Yeah.
season.
Okay, because I was gonna say I've watched episodes of that on YouTube. And then
Well,
I've
they've also had a habit, Vice has in the past, of being very lax with people's YouTube
right.
uploads.
Yeah, I could
as
have
well.
swore it was like on like the actual Vice account or Dark Side of the Ring YouTube
They've
account.
uploaded different episodes in time, but generally the pattern has been to
Yeah.
upload the
And I've also watched it
season
on
opener.
Hulu. And like true crime or docuseries, I feel like are just made for your streaming options.
Yes, exactly. And although I do agree with John Pollock that this isn't like a must binge. Like, it's not like you're gonna feel like you're missing something. It's not that like, oh my god, episodic, engaging, the way that a lot of other docuseries would be. But it's
Well,
it's definitely worth watching if you're a wrestling fan.
yeah. My takeaway from watching it was I thought, because my main interest in watching it was essentially how hard is this going to go on Vince? How deeply are they going to cover the various scandals? And what ultimately is going to be the takeaway that, like, someone that isn't me, maybe a casual wrestling fan or a non wrestling fan, would have about this? And my thought, just overall, when I watched it at the end, and this is kind of not even including the Janelle Grant stuff, because I think that is a separate animal because of the timeline of how this ended up shaking out. I thought it goes hard on Vince, but it doesn't go into the kind of detail and depth on a lot of the criticisms and the scandals. And you can pick whichever one you
Yes.
want: Nancy Argentino, Owen Hart, the Ring Boy scandal, whatever. I guess the steroid scandal they go a little bit more in depth on. But it
Yeah,
doesn't go
I thought that got a fairly decent accounting. Certainly
right.
the best overall of the different scandals.
And I think that, and again, I don't know if that was intentional or not, but my takeaway was I think the average person who, maybe knows a little bit about Vince McMahon or maybe was, watched some wrestling back in the 80s or 90s or whatever, that is turning this on. I think their takeaway would be like, this Vince guy's pretty bad, but the documentary didn't go so hard on those scandals so that you were watching this and being like, oh my God, the entire company, everyone associated with it, everyone associated with this massive product is like, reprehensible, and I want nothing to do with this. I thought it ultimately went after Vince as almost, especially by the 6th episode, as almost Vince, because Vince is for the foreseeable future, really removed from WWE. He is in some ways a safe target to go after. I
Bad
felt
man
like
gone.
Yes, correct. And that's literally when we joke about the bad man gone line, but that is that line uh basically came from an actual Netflix executive talking about the potential of airing
He didn't
WWE
use,
on
or
Netflix.
she, excuse me, didn't use those exact words, but it was close enough.
It was pretty close. She said, like, I think she said, he's gone now, so it's not an issue or something like
Yeah,
that.
pretty much. Yeah, it
Um,
was surprisingly
and,
close to Bad Man
and
Gone.
I want to say I don't necessarily ascribe to the um, conspiracy theory, if you want to call it that, that Netflix was afraid of going too hard on WWE because they just signed Raw to this huge deal, and they obviously have a huge stake in that. I think people that didn't, you could have made this documentary. We've seen plenty of people cover Vince McMahon, do things on Vince McMahon, do things on WWE, and also really neglect to go into depth on a lot of these scandals.
Yes.
So I don't think, is it, it's, did I watch part of this with a suspicion being like, they gotta be a little bit nice to WWE given the financial connection they now have with WWE. Um, and that did cross my mind, but I just thought my general takeaway was like, Vince is buried pretty good in this. They could have done a lot more, but he's buried pretty good. He's made to be shown um, as a pretty reprehensible person who is also, really disconnected from reality.
Yes.
But at the same time, I was like, I thought the company WWE as an entity got off pretty easy.
Yes, I would agree with that. As a company, I think really the only thing where they give an idea of like rot spreading beyond Vince, which inevitably also, let's just be frank, even if we didn't know anything, like it would have to. It's his company and his image. But
Mhm.
I think the only example where they really went there at all was the ring voice stuff. But yeah, this also gets into really my biggest complaint about this, which is just it's such a weirdly put together docuseries because in some areas they went much harder than I would expect. Even after, hearing what Brandon Thurston reported about what Tony Atlas accused Pat Patterson of in the documentary, I still didn't expect them to go nearly as hard on Patterson as they did. And certainly before hearing that, I never in my wildest dreams would have anticipated that they would have gone that hard on Patterson. Um, I wouldn't have even anticipated that they would have shown footage of Tom Cole, much less saying stuff about Patterson. There's that. You have Bret Hart outright saying it was happening, people were turning a blind eye to it,
Yeah,
but also how do
he
you
called
prove it?
Phillips a pedophile. He's just like, Mel
He
Phillips was
called
a
him a
pedophile.
pedophile. I think he even said he was a pedophile, he preyed on children. And you also have an exasperated Phil Mushnick just exclaiming at one point, it was a pedophile ring, in those words. So like that stuff I would not necessarily have expected, especially on something that we know at least started as a WWE co-production, at least officially stopped being a WWE co-production at some point because the credit's gone. But I don't entirely buy that they weren't involved at all anymore because I don't think a human being that doesn't work for that company would make a point of subtitling every reference to the World Wrestling Federation as World Wrestling Entertainment.
Mhm.
That's just not a thing I think that someone who doesn't work there would do. Like any single solitary soul would do. So things like that, I'm not convinced WWE wasn't involved in this putting this together at the end of the day. But go ahead.
Yeah, the subtitle thing, I think that's possible um, that was like part of like some sort of agreement prior to anything, and it just kind of
I could see that, I
even
guess.
after WWE stepped away from it, it kind of had been institutionalized in the documentary process, which is we're going to subtitle this. But I mean, I think that the thing about the Ring Boy scandal in terms of like who are the main figures in the Ring Boy scandal and where are they now? It's Vince, who's no longer connected to the company in any formal position.
And 3 dead
It's
people.
Yeah, it's Pat Patterson dead. Mel Phillips is dead, right?
He died in 2012. No one knew at the time. And then
Right.
I found it years later.
And then Tom Cole, who recently passed away,
Well, no, and Terry Garvin.
and Terry Garvin. So those are like, I don't know, I guess safe targets in the sense of
Yeah.
we can call Mel Phillips a pedophile. or we can have Bret Hart call Mel Phillips a pedophile. We can have Mushnick saying it was a pedophile ring. And all of the people that would be directly implicated in that are either Vince or dead. So no one really around the company now. That is where, and ultimately, any media and coverage and exposés and stories related to the Janelle Grant suit, I am really focused on, can we extend this beyond Vince? Because while Vince is the main figure, and Vince is along with other people like John Laurinaitis, really indicated in this suit, the company is being sued, and it defies belief that there are not many people who are still in WWE that are in positions of power of WWE that did not know that this kind of stuff was going on.
Yeah.
And WWE has managed, I don't know if this was through superior public relations or just the media figures dropping the ball in the focus, but WWE has really managed to avoid a lot of the stigma associated with this
Yes. I mean, let's
by
just put it out
kicking
there
Vince
too.
out and not erasing Vince from history essentially. And I got the same sense from this documentary, that it doesn't ask the bigger questions, which is, how did this guy get away with this for so long? And how come nobody did anything about it? And where are the people that look the other way now?
Yes. Look, with the documentary itself, unless you're squinting when they show the Janelle Grant complaint on screen momentarily, there's no reference to WWE being a defendant.
Mm-hmm.
John Laurinaitis' name is not mentioned once in the 6 hours, or that there's even a co-conspirator, or however you want to put it, any co-defendants. So they absolutely deliberately let WWE slide on that. And then circling back to the Ring Boys thing, something jumped out at me, and this was my first big gripe in the order that I watched it in. You may recall that multiple times in episode 2, and I think once or twice in episode 3, when they're talking about the steroid trial and Phil Mushnick's role leading to all that, they keep showing the same Phil Mushnick New York Post article on screen over and over and over. Sex Lies in the WWF, which was published 2 days after the Donahue episode about the scandals. So, okay, you are showing me that article, so I know you are aware of it. I know the people who put this together read it. The key thing in that article, which, as I've banged the drum on in the past, for some reason was something everyone just forgot about for almost 30 years, is that Phil explains that a couple weeks earlier, when he first talked to Vince McMahon, Vince told him and Dave Meltzer around the same time that, and this is 1992, 4 years earlier, in early 1988, he had fired Mel Phillips because, not in the word, we don't have a direct quote because Phil didn't record it, but he basically says he suspected Mel Phillips was a pedophile and rehired him as long as he agreed to quote unquote stay away from kids, which he didn't. I had documentation of Vince's limo driver also saying that it was Pat Patterson who made the suggestion to allow him to come back under those terms. But as far as the documentary, like, this is a Vince McMahon documentary. It would be bad in a broader documentary covering this regardless, but like, in a Vince McMahon documentary, the most important thing is if Vince knew or should have suspected it.
Yes, he's the Joe Paterno in this situation.
Yes, he admitted to that. I've always assumed, because it didn't click with him how that would come off. And honestly, being that very few people really jumped on that part being significant at the time, I guess he was kind of right. But that was stupid, and it's the most important question really at that point, once everyone's gone, who knew what and when and how. And he basically answered it. If the wording Phil Mushnick used was that Philip's relationship with kids seemed peculiar and unnatural. So I'm sorry, you clearly read that article. You're using it for archival repeatedly. You interviewed both Dave Meltzer and Phil Mushnick. To not mention that is clearly a deliberate choice. And that's a problem.
And I think, I kind of go in that, and with the Ring Boy scandal, they spent at least more time on that. I thought there was very little spent on the Owen Hart incident,
which they also completely botched, and we can get into that.
right? And that is one thing. The thing about the Owen Hart incident. So I have a few more takeaways with this documentary, just real quick.
Sure.
They mentioned they mentioned the names Tom Cole and Nancy Argentino. They mention the steroid scandal. They mention the Janelle Grant lawsuit. They at least mention these things because there was a world where they did this documentary and none of that stuff is mentioned.
Yes.
Right. And there are people out there who didn't know these stories before, or at least now are aware of them. There were there were hardcore wrestling fans out there, no idea who Nancy Argentino is, had no idea who Tom Cole is, who had no idea, probably don't even remember Mel Phillips. And now they do know. So that's like at least something. The Owen Hart thing, what bothers me about that is a very commonly known story, obviously, that Owen Hart died when he fell from the rafters at Over the Edge.
Yes.
But what most people don't know is that the company was essentially found liable, and that Vince's...
Well, no, they weren't found liable. They settled.
Well, you're right. They weren't found
and there
liable.
Was no trial or anything. They settled with Martha Hart and also Stu and Helen for a lesser amount, but they were part of the lawsuit. For a large enough amount to suggest they thought they would have been found liable at trial. Yes.
Correct. And I think that the company and Vince's negligence historically has been largely overlooked through the retellings of that. And so, and part of that is, and you can tie in the Ring Boy scandal and the kind of lack of exploration of that or of any of these other scandals in the documentary. If I was producing a documentary for, and this is, Bill Simmons' own words, it's not for wrestling fans. It's for the 100 million people or so who are going to see this in their Netflix carousel. I would be focusing on those extremely graphic, scandalous details in stories. And I would not be focusing nearly as much on things like the Monday Night Wars, the Montreal Screwjob, the first WrestleMania, the Attitude Era. Yeah. All that stuff might be interesting to wrestling fans. Although, and most of that stuff, we've just been totally overwhelmed with content.
Yes.
But if you're looking to just sell this thing as this crazy, scandalous product, not unlike a lot of the other things that we've seen take off on Netflix, like Tiger King, which I believe the
same director, yes,
right, would be focusing on. Tiger King is not about a guy. I actually haven't seen Tiger King, so I'm gonna.
I've managed to actually avoid watching it myself.
Yes. So, but my understanding is that Tiger King is not about a guy who like had a crazy zoo in like Oklahoma, right? It's about a guy who was involved in a murder. Ultimately, that's what people were interested in.
Yes.
And I guess if I was directing this, and I'd be like, how are we gonna, wrap people into this? It's like, this guy's involved in a ton of scandals, and let's go into deep detail in these scandals, most of which people have never even heard about. And instead, a lot of it is focused on the paint-by-the-numbers history of WWE, which I don't think would be interesting to non-wrestling fans, and is not like a good documentary, let alone ethically the message that it sends.
Yes. Joe, Netflix is not going to care about all that stuff. You got to get into some of it, but they dwelled on way too much of it. Like, the average person is not going to care about the click curtain call. For one example, like, that's not really a Vince story thing, really, at all. So yeah, I don't know if I'd call it padded in that sense. I get it, but I was going to say, I get, doing some stuff closer to that side, but like, that time should have been spent more on like the why and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're not going as hard hitting. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the big failure of the documentary, is that ultimately it's not interesting to like you or I, who are familiar with the history of WWE. But I don't know if it would be that interesting to a non-wrestling fan. Like, I think I think Joe Lanza mentioned this when I was listening to him talking about it, where he said like, if you just like watch the part about the Montreal screw job and you are not a wrestling fan at all, like Bret Hart comes across as like a baby because he's mad that he didn't get to win a fake wrestling match.
Yes, which
Like,
also is another topic that they completely dropped the ball on and just let Vince dictate the narrative.
well, yeah, and the whole thing about the Montreal screw job is, we all know it is probably the most overcovered, discussed,
Yes.
analyzed, like wrestling thing like of my lifetime. I guess I wasn't really even watching wrestling. I was too young. Uh
Yes. And
to really,
Wrestling with Shadows honestly made it worse
well, I was gonna
because
well, I was gonna say, not only is it like, do we have way too much like content on it, just generated from all sides, but we also have, out of every like scandal in the history of wrestling, we have actual behind the scenes documentation of it all.
yes, but Paul J kind of did Brett a disservice in some ways because he did edit into like the narrative that it was supposed to be Brett's last match of the company when it wasn't supposed to be, and stuff like that, and not giving the context that, especially once you know that, makes Brett's side a lot more understandable and sympathetic. So, that complicates it all too. But it's just, yeah, Montreal's something you need to talk about, but unless you're telling the actual story, how is, especially in bite-sized form, as opposed to it being part of a longer documentary like Wrestling with Shadows, like how is anyone who's not a wrestling fan supposed to understand or care about this or relate to Brett or anything? It's I don't get it. Like I said, and I guess I kind of implied earlier, like it absolutely feels like there were parts of this where they deliberately gave him a pass, not just WWE as a company, but Vince personally.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure what I make of that. You mentioned, Nancy Argentino earlier, where like they really gloss over details. Look, this is not a toot my own horn thing. But again, if we're centering this on Vince, you know, there were, a couple things that came out in 2020. So, before this was ever in production. I guess one from Dark Side of the Ring, one from me that I was able to, show people some of the same documents, but also add to. If you look at the police report from the Nancy Argentino murder, and you look at all the memos, summarizing different witness interviews, all of them are clear summaries about what was discussed. The only one that doesn't, that is just very vague and doesn't say what was talked about, is when they and the prosecutors met with Vince McMahon and Jimmy Snuka, and then the case just disappeared. Like, that's the only one, and that's obviously very suspicious.
Mhm.
Um,
Do we know if
but
like the documentaries, like, do they reach out to Nancy Argentino's family or sisters at all?
this one I don't know. I could ask. They really gloss over the whole thing very quickly too.
Right. Well, I'm curious to know, like, we talked about, like, Janelle Grant obviously wasn't featured in the documentary, but we at
But we
least
know
know they
they asked
reached
her.
out.
Yeah.
Right. And one thing across, especially because s- so much of the Vince stuff, especially the Janelle Grant stuff, is about his relationship with women and women in the company. And they did some of that with Sable, they did some of that with Trish Stratus, but they really don't. Um,
Real
they,
quick, just
that
because I don't want to lose the thread of what I was saying.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Just the other thing that I then reported in my Mel Magazine article that people can find if they want to Google it, it's called "Who Failed Nancy Argentino," although I think it has a different SEO title. Um, yeah, I think the SEO title is "Super Fly Jimmy Snuka and the Death of Girlfriend Nancy Argentino." But I found that the Dark Side of the Ring people and other people like the Allentown newspaper reporters previously had missed something that was in the police report, which was that when they talked to the cops in Syracuse uh, about, when they arrested Snuka for beating her, which they witnessed a few months earlier, one or both of the cops who in Syracuse who they talked to said that Vince had talked Nancy Argentino out of making a complaint. You know, so like you have this stuff. You have stuff that gets to Vince's involvement and potential involvement, and you just ignore it. But
Well,
yes, going back to what
we got to talk about whether or not Hulk Hogan knew that Andre the Giant was going to put him over at WrestleMania 3.
yeah, which also is another bullshit thing that I'm honestly not surprised was in there. But again, like why is the regular person even going to care about this regardless? But yeah, going back to what you were saying, I don't know if you want to continue because I do get where you were going with
Well,
it.
I was just going to say there's a real lack of female voices in this documentary.
Yes, as far as women who worked for Vince and are not family members, it's literally just Wendy Richter and Trish Stratus. The other female voices are reporters and academics, Kate Koplowitz and Bonnie Hammer from USA Network, Linda, Stephanie. I think that's it, right? There might be one or two others, but they all fit into that category.
Yeah.
The only ones who worked for Vince that aren't family are Stratus and Richter.
And so, I guess to me, like we talked about, like the documentary doesn't really explore the why, and they talk about his relationship with his father and his relationship with his kids and how that has kind of been that there's complications going both ways there. But to me, like a huge part of Vince is his relationship with women and his obsession with power. And I think when you read the Janelle Grant information that's out there, that is the number one thing that comes up is this is a guy who is obsessed with controlling someone, and he's obsessed with exploiting them sexually. And that is never really addressed in the documentary at all. It comes up a little bit in the Trish stuff. It comes up in the Trish stuff when they talk about the bark like a dog segment. It comes up a little.
Not just that with Trish, because they do get into the thing where she brings up that Vince proposed some angle where she, in her words, made out with another woman. And from the context they gave with the surrounding clips, it seems like they're talking about Mickie James during that storyline.
Right. That was people remember the storyline. That was
and the various, Mickie James was supposed to be basically in a way that they would never do now, a psychotic lesbian stalker.
I hope they would never do that now.
Yes, I would hope. But Trish said she turned it down. They did do some kind of kiss later, but certainly wouldn't qualify as making out. And Trish said something like, I don't know whether or not it was a punishment, but I lost the title a week later. And they just dropped there. There was no reflection from, included from her or anyone else in the documentary, no other talking heads, nothing. Looking at like, wait, isn't that kind of maybe sexual harassment? Like, wait a second. There's some larger issues here, and it goes to other stuff we know about too, like threatening to fire Lita and Edge if they didn't genuinely get naked under the covers in the live sex celebration angle. I think Chris Jericho or Christian have said similar things about the angle where the Dudley stripped them too, right?
Honestly, I feel like you could list off a bunch of angles if you really thought about it. Part of it is lost in just the lack of people's ability to remember everything that happened, especially like post 2002 WWE till today. But even like the bringing Sable back, like I had kind of forgotten about that whole thing.
Yeah. One of the most interesting moments in the documentary too, because if we're being blunt, and it's a little more clear if you have the subtitles on, the documentary makers are clearly trying to give the impression that Vince had a real life affair with Sable. I don't know if he did or didn't.
It's heavily implied, because you're talking about, there's a scene in the documentary for people who haven't seen it where Vince is talking about when they brought Sable back, and he talks.
But not exactly. He's asked. First, he's asked about the lawsuit, and he says he doesn't remember any of it, which is weird enough. Then they ask about bringing her back. And I believe it is Chris Smith that's doing the interviews on these. He says something like, and then she came back as your girlfriend. I don't forget the exact wording, but it's something like that. Vince gets this look on his face and seems like he's at a loss for words. And then off camera, someone who you can't tell necessarily because he's faint enough off camera just by his voice, but who the subtitles identify as Paul Heyman, starts immediately barking storyline, or in character, something like that. And Vince says he doesn't really remember that either, but the way it's included, and it even though they don't say it, it seems like they're trying to give a very specific impression, which I found fascinating.
I was getting flashbacks to the Vince McMahon yelling at the Ultimate Warrior. It's a fucking work when he's trying to record the apology. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes. The
Yeah.
apology for the fan who he was shitty to about an autograph, although Warrior denied that he did it. But Vince was trying to.
Yeah. And Heyman is playing the role of Vince in this scenario.
Kind
I
of.
mean, I listened to Bill Simmons and David Shoemaker talking about the making of the documentary on an episode of Bill Simmons' podcast that came out on Wednesday. And they mentioned, you know, Vince had a whole entourage of people with him that were, I guess, his handlers. And so, you know, I don't know if Paul Heyman was one of those people, but it would seem to give credence to the idea that Vince had some assistants who were trying to keep him on track and from trying to maybe incriminate himself further. We discussed, like, you know, the why. Like, Vince obviously started out. Vince wanted to do this project. He wanted to make a documentary about himself, and obviously they backed out, and WWE stopped, you know, partnering with them at some point. But Vince clearly, there was an idea behind this where Vince clearly wanted to try to control his own narrative in like a mass communication way, not just producing like a WWE documentary on him, but really trying to set the record straight in his mind with the general public. And I think he like arrogantly did not know what he was getting into.
Yes. Going by what I've seen about what Simmons and Shoemaker said, I haven't listened. It goes to why am I blanking on his name all of a sudden? The awful announcing guy who covers wrestling. We follow each other. I feel
Ben
bad.
Axelrod?
Yes, Ben Axelrod. He said something in his article about how Dave Meltzer is kind of the star of the documentary, which we can get into. How it almost comes off like Vince had no idea what a documentary is.
Yes. Have you ever have you ever watched the show American Dad?
The Seth MacFarlane
Yeah.
show? Not really.
Okay, well, there's an episode of American Dad where Roger, who's the alien character, it's his birthday, and he asks the people to throw a roast for him, and that ends up happening, and they end up roasting him, and he gets super upset about it because he didn't know what a roast actually was. That's what I thought of Vince. Vince is like, yeah, let's make a Netflix documentary all about me, and then it happened, and he's like, what the fuck, man? I didn't know what this was.
Yeah. Also, I don't know if this is from the same. I guess it is the same episode, but I didn't see this quote anywhere. I was pulling up Ben's page on Awful Announcing, and Simmons also made some comments about how he thinks the Netflix WWE deal may have actually saved the documentary.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough
quote.
about. I don't know enough about like the obviously Simmons does, but like the dynamics between how much creative control does WWE have over this, what could and could not get published. We talked about like the concerns about WWE being a partner in this because they're obviously wanting to be a partner so they can control the narrative to a degree.
Yes,
I'm just not clear what that is.
Simmons has always said they had no edit control, they never had final cut. Which that just doesn't feel like something Vince would get into at that point, especially since I'm curious if you remember this. When was it announced? Let me find it. There was a book that was announced, an oral history of WWE. It was announced in September 2018. That would be written by Craig Marks and Rob Tenenbaum, who did the oral history of MTV, which is a really good book for people who've never read it. And that book just kind of faded away. It never came out. But the thing that was said at the time was they were going to have full cooperation from WWE, but WWE would have no edit control over the book. Who knows exactly what happened, but it sure seems like WWE pulled cooperation in some form, because the book never happened and both authors moved on to other projects. So the fact that presumably after that dissolved, because I would kind of think that even though one's technically a Vince book and one is technically a WWE book, I kind of feel like Simon and Schuster would not have been pursuing the book that became Ringmaster if they knew by that point in early 2020 that the oral history was still coming out. So probably by then that it fell apart, or maybe not long after that. So that after that, Vince would agree to a similar situation, and one where apparently he had no out, is and always has been very curious to me.
I want to talk about the wrestlers who are featured in this documentary. The first thing that I find interesting is, it shows how challenging of a documentary this actually was to make, because for me, in journalism, if you know somebody is a highly unreliable source of information, you usually try to avoid relying on that person, using quotes from that person, using information that was given to you by that person, because you know that the information is unreliable. And when you are telling the Vince McMahon story and you're interviewing all of these wrestlers, many of whom have just really long and easily researchable histories of just being incredibly unreliable people for information. And yet, so much of this documentary is people who are just clearly full of shit, just saying shit. And from a journalistic perspective, I'm watching this documentary. I'm like, this is awful, because this is essentially, I mean, Dave and a few others, like Phil Mushnick, are there to kind of balance that out. But it just seems to me like a huge portion of this is just like, let's just let these guys say some crazy shit that is most likely not true, but maybe will be entertaining. And I would not be able to really participate in a project like that. To hear all of
Yeah.
these stories, like does Hulk Hogan really need to be in this documentary?
See, I think Hogan is someone that if you can get access, you do need to interview.
Right.
Do you have to be careful about how credibly you take him and present it? Yes. But I do think if you have access to Hogan on a Vince McMahon documentary, you do interview him. I do think that's something you do have to do under those circumstances.
It bothered I'll tell you,
Go
know
ahead.
what, one thing that really bothered me about this documentary, one small thing that is indicative of a larger thing. We talk about when they're talking about the WrestleMania 3 attendance. And okay, like the last thing I want to hear is more WrestleMania 3 attendance discussion. I don't care about it at all. But one thing that bothered me was David Shoemaker said, like, essentially defending the lying of about the number, which is like, oh, it's part of the magic of pro wrestling that you can get some people to believe this thing that's not true. That's pro wrestling at its core, and it's all part of the journey. Like, if a wrestler said that, or someone that worked for WWE said that, I'd be like, that's kind of dumb, but whatever. It's just an attendance figure. But the fact that like David Shoemaker is being counted on as a journalist or in a historian for this, both on camera and behind the scenes, and he's like, hey, it's okay if WWE just lied about this thing. That's kind of what makes it fun. That to me really frustrated me, because obviously I'm gonna, this is obviously, me greatly expanding upon that original philosophy that David Shoemaker indicated. But one of the reasons I think that Vince McMahon has been able to get away with all of the crappy stuff he's done is because he's been involved in pro wrestling, and way too many people have hand woven it as just like, oh, it's pro wrestling. Of course it's crazy and out of control.
Yes, the example that's always pointed to as the most telling example of that is the end of the Donahue episode 92, where after listening to an hour of stories about sexual harassment and all that, the last audience question, I believe it's the last one, it might be the next to last, is something like, I don't get it, isn't wrestling all fake anyway?
Right. And it goes to this whole thing when the original scandal broke out, and like there was that afternoon where like all of the cable news networks were doing things, and CNN was doing something on Vince, and like
Yeah.
the B-roll that they show while they're talking about the very real, stories and the very real allegations against him in terms of things that Vince McMahon, the individual, did to a non-consenting adult is being discussed, but the B-roll is all the Mr. McMahon character. It's, him getting his head shaved by Donald Trump, him getting a stone cold stunner and covered in beer by Steve Austin. And to me, that was like, again, Vince is again skating by in a lot of ways because people just assume the worst is pro wrestling. It's fake. None of this really matters, even though real crimes are being committed, even though there are many real victims involved in this. He's getting away with it because it's pro wrestling. And I think, like, in overall, there was a reader who sent in this information, a question. It was more of a comment than anything to Dave Meltzer when he was doing his recap of this. And the reader had a really good point in the sense of, isn't the more interesting story focusing on not like the rise of WWE and how much money Vince made? Isn't the more interesting story like, how could someone who was this morally reprehensible, that did so many different things, get away with it? What was wrong with this industry? What was sick about this industry?
Yes.
That allowed someone like this to not only survive, but become the singular most powerful person in the history of the entire industry. And that would be a more compelling documentary than, Vince, made a lot of money, but he also did some bad things. Roll credits, which is kind of what I feel like the surface level tone of the documentary is.
Yeah, there's no reflection. Like I said, there's no why. And I think a symptom of that too is it really, like, other than the other McMahons, and Bruce Pritchard, there are no like office lieutenants of Vince that are in here. Nobody who helped him build the company. There's no Bob McMullen, the original finance chief. There's no Jim Troy. There's no, even people who were technically outside the company. There's no Dick Ebersol. There's no Jim Ross.
Jerry McDevitt.
I mean, that's actually a pretty glaring one now that I think about it, which he must have been interviewed, right?
So it would have to be like, when did I'm trying to think like when he
He
retired.
retired last year.
Yeah. So how did that fit into the filming process and things like that?
Right.
And
The
honestly,
bulk
I
of
don't
the
know.
interviews were done
I
in
don't know if
2021 and 2022.
Yeah.
So
I don't know if he would have been more likely to be interviewed pre or post working for Vince. I don't know. I know he's done interviews.
when he was still working for Vince, he has not given any real interviews since he retired. So I mean, that's the thing too, knowing how he works, knowing how they work. Unlike Jim Ross, where we know he wasn't interviewed, and I think we can assume that, the people I named, and including Dick Ebersol, weren't interviewed, because I feel like you'd at least include like a cursory Dick Ebersol like soundbite talking about Saturday Night's Main Event.
Mhm.
We know Jim Ross wasn't interviewed. We can assume the others weren't interviewed. I don't know if I see a universe where Jerry McDevitt's not interviewed at all, at least about the steroid trial. So it is conspicuous that he's not there.
Yeah, and to your point, there's very little outside of Pritchard, who just has no value because you can't believe anything that he says. There really isn't another one of those lieutenant. I guess, like, Paul Levesque is interviewed.
Paul Levesque's barely in it, though.
I know. Well, what did I say about the start of this? That we don't want to connect Vince too much with what is currently going on in WWE.
Yes.
So there's not a lot of current. I mean, obviously it's a historical documentary focusing on a 40-year snapshot in time, but there's really very little like people who are. So Cody Rhodes is in it to really provide no real value other than to just put someone in it. Roman Reigns is basically not mentioned at all in the documentary. They mentioned The Rock and there's some John Cena in there. But it's mostly focused on retired wrestlers. There's very little to do with anything that can be connected to the current product, which I think maybe was a deliberate choice.
Yes. I think it has to, at least in terms of editing later on, yes. Earlier on, I guess it's a little surprising there are some newer stars that aren't in there. But yeah, in terms of the editing, it does overall feel like this was deliberately edited in a way to distance him from WWE. It absolutely does.
And yeah, there's no Nick Khan, there's no Ari Emanuel. There's none of these people that have played really pivotal roles in the recent history of WWE. Again, we're coming into the timeline. Like, would they have, Ari Emanuel obviously comes into WWE and very recently, after most of this filming has taken
You know
place.
what, though? Ari Emanuel did have a history with the company, though, representing them in the past, too.
Yep. No George Barrios, I don't think, was interviewed, or at least we didn't see him.
Michelle Wilson, no one like that.
Yeah, the closest we get is like people like Bonnie Hammer and like other executives that
outside the company.
Yeah, we're part of the company. The other thing I want to mention is, and this has been something that's been going on the last year or two since the scandals first broke, or the most recent particular scandals, the wrestlers who in their relationship with Vince, and despite oftentimes when they tell stories about him, they talk about essentially either borderline or actual abuse at the hands of Vince. They still almost to a fault. Every single one of them has just incredible admiration for Vince.
Mm-hmm.
And that was reflected in this documentary. So many people view Vince as their father. It's very odd. I was, as I'm sure you were, like, just incredibly, this wasn't the documentary, but just like incredibly disappointed in Vince McFoley's comments regarding Vince and the Janelle Grant lawsuit.
Yeah, especially because he knows better. That's the thing.
No, I mean, he was on the board of RAIN.
He was a trained rape crisis counselor who worked their web chat hotline.
But Papa Vince is okay. But like, and just it goes to speak of like the hold that Vince has over these people. And it's so funny to me. It's actually not really funny. It's actually tragic, but there's it's so interesting to me in that you have all these old school wrestlers like The Undertaker who, like, I'm sure envision themselves and carry themselves like they're these, guys who only care about making money and being old school and drawing houses and business, and they don't care about all the other stuff. And because that's like the old school mentality, is be super business focused, always look out for yourself. That is the old school Bruiser Brody mentality that I feel like a lot of these guys want to model themselves after. Yet at the same time, they just absolutely love Vince. They seem to have very little pride in their own work. Everything just seems, if you listen to them, everything that they achieved, Vince is responsible for. Vince invented pro wrestling. Vince made pro wrestling popular. Vince allowed them to make a bunch of money. Vince deserves all the credit. And it's just it's like this incredible irony in the sense that these guys view themselves as so old school, business focused guys, yet they just absolutely love a promoter. And you got The Undertaker saying, I'd take a bullet for Vince. And at the same time, he wants to carry himself as like this old school badass. And it's like, it's just this irony to me, but it's also sad because I think it speaks to the psychological hold that Vince has over these people. Vince can do a million bad things. And because he, gave them a job and believed in them in a way that allowed them to make a lot of money being a pro wrestler, Vince can do ultimately no wrong in their eyes. All of his sins can be forgiven. All of his crimes can be overlooked. It's an incredible psychological hold he seems to have over these guys.
Daddy Vince. It really is a weird Stockholm Syndrome thing that he has over them, and it seems like it was deliberate, certainly. And it's weird, because, like, it's hard to find the line of exactly where you empathize with some of them. Mick Foley, who especially, has a lot of brain trauma and stuff. You figure that might be working.
That is playing a role in a lot of this.
I kind of think it has to.
Not for Steve Austin, though.
Well, he's not a CTE guy. Jim Ross clearly is someone who, not the same way Vince abused women, but was still very abusive too as an employer. There's that. And, also, Jim's history of working for, Bill Watts, who's not the same, but also definitely not the best boss.
Right, it came up, but that's like they came up in a wrestling industry environment where Vince's behavior that he has been accused of has been tolerated.
Yeah. And to say nothing of JR's childhood too, and the stuff he's talked about with his dad being emotionally abusive and whatnot. So, like, I get that. And then even, you know what, like, I said this when I was on Pollock and Thurston. Even to a degree, I can empathize a little bit with Mark Henry and potential denial and stuff there. Because you know what? If I was a black wrestler who had been in that company, I can't put myself in their shoes. But I can certainly understand how if you're a black wrestler who's been in that company and especially has been in sexualized storylines, I can get to a point why you might have some issues dealing with some of the stuff in the lawsuit. I can't put myself in their shoes, but I can see how it would happen. So, like, there are degrees to which, like, you can kind of see it, but it's like you don't want to go all the way with that, especially with stuff like Henry said. But I do get where some of them end up conflicted based on the ringer he put them through, So it's really tricky to find the balance there, like what Henry said was pretty egregious, and I'm not excusing it. But in terms of the larger internal struggle, I can sort of see where it comes from.
Yeah, it just seems like, there's a few wrestlers out there that will say negative things about Vince, but like someone like Mick Foley loves Vince. Someone like Bryan Danielson loves Vince.
Although Bryan has been more reflective in recent months.
He has been, but he's also said some things that have kind of disappointed me. And I point out Mick Foley and Bryan Danielson as guys that are, I would call, atypical from pro wrestlers and how open and candid they have been about their wrestling careers and feel more like real people than like Tony Atlas or The Undertaker. Or
yeah, and on some level, it seems like Vince had some kind of weird respect for that type of person, and that, like, on some level, he did treat them differently from a lot of other people who worked for them. And, with Danielson, too, we should say, like, and he did kind of say something like this in his last comments. Like, he probably just shouldn't be saying anything publicly, given his soon-to-be stepfather-in-law's role in it.
Right.
But go ahead.
No, I think it's a part of this documentary that I think is going to age really interesting and probably poorly is the wrestler comments. Especially if you had not watched. I feel like Dark Side of the Ring is that it's like a little bit more the wrestler comments are a little bit more under control.
Well, and also, I don't know how obvious you feel like this is to the viewer, but Evan Husney has said repeatedly that he specifically is taking the tact of, yes, we know they're wrestlers and they're bullshitters, but I'm going to give you each side that people are giving me and let you decide.
Yeah, that's I guess my point is that it's a little bit. My impression from watching the Dark Side of the Ring episodes is, and you obviously know much more about how the sausage is made on that end. I never got the sense that I'm like, oh, why am I listening to all these bullshit wrestlers bullshit around? As opposed to this Vince McMahon documentary, and especially because it's talking about WWE pseudo history and stuff like that. I'm like, why am I watching these wrestlers bullshit? I guess I did feel that way when like Vince Russo and Jim Cornette were having a spat on Dark Side of the Ring. But by and large, I think like it feels to me like this was probably an eye opener for a lot of people who maybe haven't watched like a lot of shoot videos or things like that of what some of these guys are really like. And like I think one of the big things that I saw trending on social media, at least on my feed, which probably doesn't mean that much because it's so wrestling centric, but like the Steve Austin CTE comments, like Steve Austin, who's a really, really hugely famous individual, just being like, yeah, man, I don't believe in that CTE. That was news, I think for people who were talking about it.
Especially since Austin, it seems like he is usually pretty self-aware about how to present himself in public.
Right. He's not like Hulk Hogan or Tony Atlas or one of these guys that will just say kind of anything. Or even like a player. Like,
And like, if he like, even like, if you buy that he's telling the truth, that the terms of his divorce from Deborah bar him from really saying anything specifically about what happened, like, he has tried to, within those terms, basically apologize, say he's embarrassed of what he did, and that he was going through a lot of drug and emotional issues at the time.
he's had his podcast where he comes across as, at least, as a relative straight shooter
Yes,
comparison to other wrestlers. So
but
people
he's
feel like
self-aware. Like, he's aware
yeah,
of what people think. He's aware of what people think about the domestic violence charges too. Like, it doesn't seem like he's a like off in left field wrestler brain guy. So that was really surprising. But on the other hand, it didn't necessarily seem like he believed what he was saying, because, as Trevor Dame put it on Twitter, he looked like an LA Noir like interrogation subject.
yeah, like he was like
He scratched his ear very
yeah,
performative right
like
after he said it.
yeah, he was he should have been holding up a newspaper, like a of that day,
Yeah,
like a PW or a, prisoner of war would, a hostage.
but yeah, it looked like the press X to doubt or whatever it is meme from LA
Yeah,
Noir. Like Trevor was dead on in saying that. So like, I don't think he even necessarily believed it. I don't think he was saying it performatively, but I think that's him
do you
having his
believe
own concerns and not wanting to admit it.
do you believe that Vince doesn't believe in it? Because there's a comments about the Undertaker not remembering the Brock Lesnar WrestleMania match also would indicate that Vince is in the same boat.
There's a lot of things I figured that Vince would be insane about in the documentary. Him saying, despite going to the hospital with him, that he didn't believe Undertaker got a concussion in the Brock Lesnar WrestleMania 30 match, and he was just, traumatized by having to do a job, was a level of insane I was not prepared for.
Yeah, I think, it was really interesting. I had just watched, right before I watched this, I watched um the Tony Hawk documentary on HBO called Until the Wheels Come Off, which I don't know if you've seen it, but anyone that has interest in like skateboarding should watch it. It's really good. And towards the end of the documentary, Tony and several of his contemporaries who are now like in their 50s are talking about the physical toll of a lifetime skateboarding has had on them. And in one of the more reflective moments, one of them, I forget, it might have been like Mike McGill, but he says, like, pretty emotionally, like, I know that I have what those football players have. Like, I know that's happening to me. And like, so I went from seeing that, these skateboarders, to like these wrestlers who just don't have any self-awareness whatsoever and are just living in complete denial. And it also goes to show why some of these people, have a hard time believing Vince did what he did, because they live in this fake carny world where it's very easy to deny things. Even something like, I probably have significant brain damage because I was a wrestler for years and years and didn't necessarily take care of my body.
Yes, I think that's a fair way to assess that. And yeah, and look, I mean, it's fairly obvious from watching the documentary that Vince is having severe memory issues that probably go beyond age related too. We know that he had an entourage around him at every interview designed to jog his memory. We know from exhibits in the Ultimate Warrior DVD lawsuit that has been something that's been going on WWE documentary suits going back to at least the mid 2000s. There's an email that's like carefully teaching the production assistant how you interview Vince, how to make sure he doesn't get angry if you talk about something he doesn't remember, stuff like that, and that's, a good 20 years ago, when he's only in his late 50s.
Yeah, part of
So,
that might just be Vince's natural attitude. Like,
well, though that's part of that too, but I think it's also
like,
a belligerence that he can't remember too.
yeah, he yeah, I mean, he definitely, go back and watch the Attitude Era. He definitely took many shots to the head, and I don't know like how much of a trained wrestler Vince really was.
Dr. Tom Pritchard did give him proper training going into his early matches. I don't know
Right.
exactly how much, but these days, look, what's becoming one of the most common models for wrestling schools is to do a 12-week class.
Mhm.
Lance Storm was really kind of the pioneer of it. Seth Rollins and Merrick Brave do it at Black and Brave. I believe Sean Spears and Tyler Breeze do it at Flatbacks. And there are others I'm not remembering. Oh, Nightmare Factory does it. So it's becoming really like the thing at a name brand wrestling school. So, I mean, yes, he started old, but the idea that he could be quote unquote trained in a limited number of weeks is not outlandish. But he's also a beat up old man to some degree at that point,
And he's going
regardless.
out largely doing like dangerous stuff, like
His
taking chair
first
shots to the head.
match, he took that bump off the cage into the announcer's desk where he messed up his tailbone. Although that it seems like was more from landing on the corner than just the overall bump,
Yeah.
or not the
I get,
corner, the edge.
yeah.
But still, like that, like just all the shots to the head. Like he's taking punishment. He's taking a lot of shit to the head. There was the Kevin Owens, shoot headbutt several years back, too.
Yeah. Like the famous, the introduction to Mr. Sacco scene. Like when Stone Cold just brains him with a bedpan. Like I don't
Oh,
know
it
if that
just
was gimmicked.
echoes.
Yeah, or not. But uh, he definitely took his fair share of brain trauma, even if he didn't necessarily wrestle, for 30 straight years. Um,
Yes.
and I think,
And probably didn't give himself any time to recover from any of them either.
no, why would you? If you retire, you should just die. I
That was
kind
a
of knew.
wild one too.
Yeah,
It
but
didn't
that's that. I knew
surprise
he would
me,
say that.
but it was still something to hear. Um, I mean, really, the most shocking individual comment, the one that like most viscerally hit me from him in the whole documentary, was because we've never actually heard him talk about Rita Chatterton in his own voice ever
Mhm.
before. When he says, he says what you would expect, that it was completely consensual. And then he adds, but if it had been a rape, the statute of limitations had already expired.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll tell you this. I won't say who. I talked to someone who's known Vince and worked for him. And we're texting with them as they were watching the documentary. They had a similar reaction. Like they were shocked when they saw that.
Right. And I've seen like the meme going around showing like the OJ Simpson "If I Did It, Here's How" book.
Yes.
Um, which
Yeah,
is
that's just not a thing you say in any like real like scenario. And then of course, civilly,
and
the statute of limitations then got lifted, and they had, the postscript note about Rita Chatterton threatening to sue and getting the multi-million-dollar settlement.
yeah, they left that in there. They could have deleted that
Yeah,
line.
I mean, credit to them for putting that in there and doing it in a way that also, hung a lampshade on Vince's comment. But that was the thing that really jumped out most at me, as we, kind of circle away from the concussions and stuff like that. That's not a thing I ever would have expected him to say. I would have just expected a hard denial and the rest of what he said, but not. Oh, and also even just the wording, if it had been a rape, not if I was guilty, not if it had happened. If it, like, it just felt so weird. And then just to say that really jumped out at me. Honestly, it's the type of thing that makes you wonder what other things like that he might have said too. Like, and also like there's other stuff where they do address it that he's not even asked about. Like they do address the tanning salon stuff, but only in the last episode. We don't hear from him about that, which makes me wonder if they didn't ask him when they were interviewing him. Um, but I mean, honestly, like in terms of stuff we hadn't heard from him about before, there really isn't that much in
Well,
his
yeah, and that's why
interviews.
the documentary is like not, in a lot of ways, not that interesting to people that know the history at all. I'm a big Bill Simmons fan in general, but I was listening to him and David Shoemaker were talking about making this documentary, And they said, people, they wanted to make it balanced. And to me, I think that is kind of like a very nefarious philosophy that has really contributed greatly to um, poor media coverage
Yes,
across
if you
the
are
spectrum.
trying to be balanced, it's inherently imbalanced because you're giving credence to stuff that shouldn't get credence.
Correct. And too much of journalism is bogged down by, we got to get both sides on this issue. Even if, with I don't know, journalism school, they tell you, like, if one person says it's sunny outside and you look outside and it's sunny, and then someone goes, actually, it's raining, and you look outside and it's still sunny, you don't then give both of those people equal credence.
No.
And credibility in terms of how you present them. And I think that is kind of just like a really destructive idea where it's like, we got to be balanced. We got to show all sides to this. And it's like, well, one side is this just crazy, insane person. And it's like, how, like, do we really need to have a balanced portrait of Vince McMahon? Do we really need to be coming away with this thinking, Vince was kind of good and he was kind of bad? It's hard to judge people when the overwhelming amount of evidence around Vince McMahon's life, and especially around his professional career, is that he's a very bad person who did a lot of bad things and is unrepentant of them.
Yes.
And that should be from the journalistic perspective, with knowing all of the information, that should be the takeaway from the documentary. It should not be that Vince is complicated, because honestly, I don't think Vince is that complicated. That's another thing I hear all the
Bad
time.
people can do good things and good people can do bad things.
Well, like, I've read a decent amount of books about highly successful individuals. I'm actually reading a book right now on William Randolph Hearst. And a lot of the things are very similar to these people that are hugely successful in terms of they make a lot of money, is that they have a lot of arrogance and they think they can do whatever they want. And that's essentially what Vince's last 40 years of his life had been. He made a lot of money. He's got a lot of arrogance, and he thinks he can do whatever he wants because he's had a lot of power throughout his career, and he's had a lot of money, which gives him a lot of power even outside of the realm of being the boss of his own company. He can pay people off. He can pay people to do things that he wants. He can outspend people, all that kind of stuff. And that has allowed him to be somebody that doesn't care about anybody else and selfishly thinks they can get away with everything. The reason he decided he wanted to do this documentary was because he thought that he could do it and it wouldn't have a negative impact really on him. And I can actually see why he would think that, because he's never been held accountable really for anything in his life up until extremely recently.
No, he never has. He got indicted, but he got indicted on especially with hindsight, shockingly flimsy case that you can't really understand why they brought it, which honestly is that is the biggest fault of the steroid trial segment, that they don't really explain what the charges were and why the acquittal was such a no-brainer. Like, they just summarize it as they couldn't prove distribution, but like, it is important to know that they thought they had a smoking gun and it turned out it was physically impossible.
Yeah. I think the other thing with the steroid trial in general, and what kind of made it in some ways like a safe topic to go into depth with, is I don't think people care about that wrestlers in the 90s were on steroids.
No.
Like the same way they would care about like Rita Chatterton or Nancy Argentino or the Ring Boys.
Well, okay, that brings up something I did want to talk about. And I think it also affects the progression of the Janelle Grant scandal. I get the feeling that the average person, for various reasons, including seeing stuff like that at their own jobs, is not going to be that moved strictly by affairs with subordinates. A lot of us agree now that the power imbalance, especially with someone like a billionaire CEO, is so great that you can't really, in the moral sense, consent to sex with your boss. In a legal sense, it's murkier, but like morally, like, no. But a lot of people aren't that moved by that. And at least the way that most people heard about the initial part of the scandal with the hush money and the Wall Street Journal story, the first one in June 2022, that was basically what most people took away from it. Now, anyone who actually read the Wall Street Journal story should have taken more from it, because there were always hints that there was more going on. The comment from Janelle Grant's friend in the email to the board about her being passed like a toy to John Laurinaitis, and how she was scared of Vince and Jerry McDevitt. There was always
in like the graphic details of, it's not like they had a normal consensual relationship.
Well, we didn't know that at the time. That's what I'm saying.
Right.
So like, if you're going by summaries and stuff, I get how it didn't quite land as much as it could have. And then, a few weeks later, it's that there are more NDAs, including one woman who, not in the words of the article, but clearly what they're trying to say, accused him of rape, quote unquote coerced sex act, which is rape. And that and the large settlements and stuff, I think, was what really pushed him to resign and caused it to land a little more. And then it's all the details coming out in the actual lawsuit from Janelle Grant. That's what put it over the top. You had a name, not necessarily a face. Well, there was a photo they put out, but not a recognizable face to all this and all these specifics. And I think that's really what nailed him. Even if there was already stuff about things being more black and white, non-consensual, like it needed to be pushed over the top for him to really see any kind of repercussions.
Really, the repercussions were Slim Jim was going to pull out of sponsoring the Royal Rumble.
And that could have set off other sponsors.
Right. They was afraid that this was going to have like a
domino. Well, no, I mean, they did pull out. It wasn't that they considered it. Yeah. They said they were pulling out.
Yeah. So,
and then they came back in the next day after Vince pulled out, or I think 2 days later, whatever it was.
Right.
So, like, and even then, he hasn't seen any real financial repercussions. Like, he's made money from selling his stock and stuff. So, like,
right, he's been removed from the company, but
yes, it's the hit of having his company taken away from him right now, and then potentially, if there are criminal charges, whatever. But I do want to ask you, though, just not without getting into specifics about rumors and stuff for obvious reasons. If there was a scandal that came out about an executive or executives in the company where the extent of it was affairs with subordinates and nothing criminal, is that something that you think would move people? If it was explicitly that, even with women putting their names on it and stuff, do you think that would move people? Or do you think me and the people I talk to are kind of in the right boat that, like, it should matter, but most people probably wouldn't care?
Like, if we're talking like Vince?
Any, like, key executives in the company.
Yeah, well, Vince is like a really public figure.
Yeah, so public figure types. I don't want to name names for specific,
okay.
for obvious reasons, but like public figure executives in WWE.
No, we've seen it happen many times.
Yes. It should, but I think, like, I don't know if any of them would even feel the need to resign if something like that happened, and came out and got reported on.
No, I mean, again, we've seen it. There are plenty of people. Elon Musk comes to mind as just one person.
Yes, although he has some non-consensual allegations too, but
right, but people don't even care about that much.
Not really, no.
Not enough to seriously impact him. And like ultimately, like the whole Janelle Grant case is that ultimately, I think people don't care. People cared enough, I guess, for Vince to get ousted from power, but people don't care enough for it to really impact WWE in a negative way at this point in time.
Yeah, and
it hasn't impacted their business. People were really excited for the Royal Rumble when it happened, even though it was just a few days after the Wall Street Journal story. It wasn't like people were like, "I'm never watching this company again."
I was honestly shocked by how little it's had an effect. I think so much of that is just the type of fan base they've cultivated. I'm not making a blanket comment about everyone who watches and enjoys WWE.
Statistically poorer and dumber?
No, I don't even mean that. Just in terms of the hardcores, it's like they're really, and it's not the only hardcore fandom that's like this, of course, but like they're really going to insulate themselves, and something like Bad Man Gone is going to convince them. But even then, we
Well,
still see
and
plenty
they're
of
getting
idiots
what
that are still pro Vince. But go ahead.
right. I was gonna say, like, a lot of those fans are getting what they want. They got Vince gone. They've got what they believe is a better product. They've got Paul Levesque in charge. Like, to them, this was a win. It's not something to run away from.
Yes. So I was shocked by, I think, how little effect there's been. I guess because I guess so far it hasn't really led to that much in terms of others coming forward. There's been a little bit, but not a lot. I think that's part of it, but just in general, like, just given how specific it was, and like, even if you set the allegations aside as allegations, just the text messages, like, and then knowing also just from the lawsuit, the things specific that then relate to the employees and the wrestling product, and all the ways that it was intertwined, like, I would have expected it to have a little more of an effect. Like, I expected it to be more of an existential threat to the company. And at this point, it seems like it's not necessarily an existential threat to the company as much as it is to Vince.
Yeah, I think the major thing going forward, and again, what I want to keep an eye on is if more information comes out of people who were high up in the company and that are still high up in the company are implicated for at least knowing something. Like, I personally believe that Paul Levesque knew about this. Now, do you know every single detail? I don't know, but I believe he's playing.
I believe he knew, if nothing else, that there was an affair with a subordinate who was there because he gave her basically a no-show job, and
Yeah,
that there's the power imbalance and all that. Like, he absolutely would have known
yeah,
that, I'm
he
sure.
can stand up there in the little pressers and play dumb all he wants, but I believe that. But until we get really concrete evidence that suggests that, I don't think it's going to really have an impact on the company, because I think the company has successfully, and I think this documentary in a lot of ways helped it. You know, the problems, the moral and ethical problems that come with WWE came from the came from Vince's involvement. And now that Vince is gone, everything's fine because it was just one bad apple, as opposed to the entire core of the company and really the industry as a whole
Yes.
bearing
And
a lot of the responsibilities for these problems. You want to know what there was very little talk about was Saudi Arabia.
in the documentary, I don't think they said
Yeah,
anything about Saudi Arabia.
correct. And we're talking about there's the whole plane incident, the whole sports watching propaganda incident. I mean, that to me is a major recent part of WWE and Vince and Vince's involvement. Even help going as far as Vince to build relationships between UFC and Saudi Arabia. And that wasn't touched at all. And I have to think that one of the reasons that wasn't touched at all was because that's something that's going on now. That's the current connects the current company. They weren't going to have something in there that's like, oh yeah, and then Vince has these really sketchy shows where they do propaganda for the Saudi government, and Vince, all the wrestlers were held hostage on an airplane, which I think would be a super scandalous story and should be one, but it's something that WWE does now. They've got a show in Saudi Arabia coming up, so they're obviously not going to have. So that I'm suspicious. That's why I don't think it was in the documentaries, because again, this documentary is really avoiding anything connecting Vince to the current product.
Yes. Yes. What were we saying just before that? Because I had a point that I then forgot. What were we talking about before you pivoted to Saudi Arabia? Yeah.
I forget now. We were talking about Paul Levesque and knowing about.
And who would have known what? Where was I going with that? I don't remember. Maybe it'll come back to me.
All right.
But
I do want to mention this before we kind of wrap up is the role that Dave Meltzer, and to a lesser extent Phil Mushnick, played in this documentary in terms of I'm sure you saw the stuff about the Who Killed WCW documentary, and kind of why there were no journalists involved in that documentary. And they essentially was, we didn't want to, essentially they basically, whoever, I don't know if it was the director, the producer.
It was Evan Husty.
Oh, it was. Somebody essentially said, we didn't want to have that kind of perspective in the story for whatever reason, probably to contradict many of the dumb things Eric Bischoff said.
Well, no, what did he say? It was something like that he felt like there were enough like specific beefs with some of the people in the documentary, I think mainly referring to Meltzer and Bischoff, that he
Mhm.
felt like they would come off as biased. I'm not getting to the exact quote, but it was something in that zip code. But
Yes.
it was such a weird comment because I know we're getting away from the main topic, but I do think I should note this. It was such a weird comment because, like, okay, like, I like Guy Evans, but he wrote Bischoff's second book with him, and Guy Evans is in it. And also, like, okay, if you're
Picturing the cover of Bishop's book now, the Grateful is what it's called. It's like
yes,
him like out in Wyoming.
I mean, great scenery, but if you but okay, let's go with the idea he's specifically referring to the Meltzer Bischoff stuff. Bischoff is complimentary of Wade Keller and Jason Powell. I mean, Wade Keller's around for the whole time Bischoff's in WCW. Jason came along a little later. He was only there for part of it, but yeah, like, that's not a reason not to include Wade Keller. But now going back to the Netflix thing, I mean, I think Dave comes off great in most of it. Like, I thought he did a very strong job in the
Yeah.
Netflix documentary.
Dave is presented as essentially a neutral, somewhat authoritative source for a lot of this stuff.
Yes.
You're dealing with the Carney wrestlers, and you're dealing with Vince and his faulty memory and all his Vinceisms, and you need to have somebody there. And at some points, like different executives from different companies come in and play this role too. But Dave is essentially there as this is the person who's going to say what actually happened, and here are these Carney wrestlers that are going to lie about it to an extent. And so he comes across really well, and I wonder if that will ultimately have an impact on the way some people view Dave. Um, there's obviously people that are always going to think that Dave is nothing but like a hack liar who just makes things up. But I do wonder if people who had never, really listened to Dave or read anything Dave did before watched this documentary and maybe thought, that's Dave Meltzer guy. Because I mean, the message from the movie is that Dave Meltzer, is a reliable source of information. And I do wonder if this will help his reputation going forward. Because he
I
kind
think
of
it
comes across as like
could.
he comes across as like the big winner of this documentary.
Yeah, at least among like the kind of wrestling fan that knows who he is, but either didn't know much or didn't like him, I would think that unless you're just a total weird tribalist, it should help.
I think
Um,
most people that don't know who Dave Meltzer is before this documentary probably just saw him as this random journalist guy. Like,
yes, who came off well, but yes. So yeah, I think it could help with some people, but I think a lot of people would have, you know, already made up their minds too.
right, there's lost
Uh,
causes amongst the
yes,
group, but
yes, yes,
I think a lot of like because for various reasons, like Dave bashing, um, mostly for a lot of it for stuff that he didn't even do, um, has become like a cottage industry for certain members of our uh, wrestling
yes.
world. He's become like this kind of like almost like mythical figure to certain people, where
Yeah, it's
like
not.
the
It doesn't seem
preeminent.
like it.
I
Go
was gonna
ahead.
say I was gonna say he's in a lot of, and for some people like Dave Meltzer is like the preeminent villain in professional wrestling,
Yes.
and it
It
also
doesn't
gets
seem
people.
like shitting on him pays off financially the same way the anti AEW grift does, but it for some people it goes hand in hand.
Yes, and I mean, and I've talked about this a million times. Like all of that stuff kind of gets in the way of like actual criticism of Dave that should be levied, but um, because so much of it is just bullshit.
Yes,
Uh,
most the biggest criticisms you hear the most about Dave are not the actual things he should be criticized
yeah,
for.
they're complaining about Shawn Michaels and Undertaker getting 4 3/4 stars,
Exactly. Oh, yeah, pretty
or
much.
Mabel being the third man, or uh, the Tokyo Dome and stuff like that. But I do think that this was a positive documentary for showing people in the wrestling media, for the most part, being presented as credible, and that to the degree, and especially at the expense of the wrestlers who are shown as not being credible in a lot of the scenes. Um, Bruce
Yes.
Pritchard being, one of them for sure, because there's a brutal cut of, Bruce Pritchard said in that documentary.
Yes. And as far as like Phil Mushnick, I think we should be clear for people who don't know much about him. Like, outside of the context of the stuff about WWE, like, Phil can be very problematic in a lot of ways and a lot of things he said and written. And he's a hothead. But because he's pretty much always, with one or two small exceptions, been in the right in the stuff with the McMahons and WWE, he comes off great in this documentary. And honestly, given the subject matter and where he was on it, rightfully so. But I can also imagine... Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, he's one of the only people that just like speaks bluntly about Vince.
Yes.
In the documentary.
Yes.
Which is very refreshing when you're watching it.
Yes, I do think that if Brett was re-interviewed like this year, I think Brett would have been more blunt about him. Not that he wasn't at all. But, Brett, to his credit, is probably, certainly the older wrestler who's done the most reflection in light of the Janelle Grant lawsuit and whatnot. But, yeah, like, he is blunt in a way that almost nobody else is. Even really even Dave isn't, There's
Dave's the opposite. Dave has at least 30 words of preamble before he even says anything.
Right. There are the clips about like, oh, I don't know why he had this grudge against me. And then it cuts to Phil and he says, because he's a dirtbag.
Right. And that's really like refreshing when you're watching the documentary, I felt.
Yes. And, as we talked about earlier, they could have gone harder even on why he felt that way. But he comes off well. And it's probably for people who know him, like New York sports fans who don't know the wrestling stuff, it probably comes off fairly jarring. Like, I remember, people who I worked with who were really only familiar with him more broadly and like this, critical coverage of him at Deadspin and stuff were kind of shocked when like I started working on some of the Ring Boy related stuff and telling them about it and like just how well he came off in it. So I got to think, to some people who are just used to him as being this weirdly self-righteous guy who has said some kind of racist things at times, that like I got to think it's kind of shocking to see him being so in the right.
Yeah, and it's also, I think that's just like speaks to like just the complicated nature of wrestling.
Yeah.
And like where the bar is, right? The bar is pretty low for someone, and that's ultimately the message.
Yes.
Is there anything else you want to add that we haven't got to?
Okay.
I kind of want to wrap this up so Rich Cage doesn't yell at me for the file being too big.
I thought Tony Atlas honestly came off better than most people in the documentary. There are some things that do hurt his credibility. He was not at the Madison Square Garden show where David Schultz slapped John Stossel, for example, like he said. But overall, I felt he came off honest, reflective, remorseful about some things. The comment about, where he says, we all treated women terribly. We abused them. We used them like toys. I felt like he came off honest about Pat Patterson. But in general, just at least his tone, like he came off like shockingly no bullshit. He came off much more worldly than most of the wrestlers who were in there, which I found interesting. How did you think he came off?
He, like, when we're talking about, like, I guess he's blunt. I guess if we were talking about, when I said, Phil Mushnick's really blunt, I'm like, Tony Atlas is actually really blunt. There's like the famous one that's making the rounds that I think it's like Vince being like, I love my father, and then cut to Tony Atlas. I think he always hated his father.
Oh, I didn't even remember that part. I was thinking more about, I thought you were going to say the part where they're talking about Patterson, and they're like, you couldn't have told someone. He's like, who? Pat's the booker. And then
and he's like laughing. He's like,
he's laughing. And he's like, you do not understand this business at all. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
so I thought,
I don't know. Like, I feel like I don't know how reliable. To me, he doesn't feel like a reliable source of anything.
But he also doesn't strike me as someone who would say what he said Patterson did to him just made up, like in those details. Like, I feel like like just knowing his background and everything, like I do buy that story. But yes, it's not like he's perfect credibility wise. Like even I mean, he's a wrestler from that
He
era,
is.
so
I'll tell you
that's
what. He
natural.
is. He's pretty. He's pretty regularly featured in this for someone who's really not like that integral to like telling the Vince McMahon story.
Yeah, and really overall, like he had, I think, like 3 or 4 different runs in the company, but over like in total, like he really didn't spend that much time there. So it is interesting that he's relied on so much, but I thought he gave good insight. What else? There's something I want to mention, but I'm trying to figure out the best way to say it. I won't say what parts I'm talking about. There is some editing choices at times that seems like they are suggesting certain specific women were victimized that have not publicly said anything. And I was not crazy about that choice.
Yes, I noticed that too. Because I think if you're in the know, this is going to be an obnoxious piece of audio because they're like, yeah, we know. But I think most people who've seen the documentary know what we're talking about.
I mean, I'll put it this way, without alluding to the part of the documentary we're talking about. There are certain details about one of the NDAs where it's fairly easy to figure out who it was talking about.
Yes, just using the timeline
Based on what was reported.
Yeah.
Yes, based on the timeline and stuff. And yeah, I didn't like that.
Well,
It just felt very like going against all like current best practices for journalism and journalism adjacent stuff.
Well, yeah, and something else that they go into is they essentially do something that we all basically knew based on the evidence, but that Brock Lesnar is essentially was the person in the Janelle Grant lawsuit.
Well, they had Khadijah say, Khadijah from Wall Street Journal say, like, sources told them it was Brock Lesnar.
Yeah.
So I was a little surprised, honestly, given everything else that they included that, which makes me think he may not be coming back to WWE.
Right. I thought my opinion on Brock was that they were eventually going to bring him back at some point. And they still very well might. But from I know Paul Levesque was asked about him at one of the press conferences, and he basically said, like, oh, yeah, he'll basically gave off an answer that he,
yes,
eventually
but
he's going to come back.
Here's something to that, too, that I think people are overlooking. Based on at least what we know, if the feds are trying to get him on trafficking, Brock Lesnar is the best witness they have that we know of.
Right.
Specific to a forced or coerced commercial sex act.
Well, maybe John Laurinaitis, but yes.
Well, but that's not necessarily commercial.
Right. What you're saying is that
specific to federal sex trafficking charges. Yes.
Yes. And essentially, if I recall correctly, what's in the lawsuit is that Vince was essentially offered Janelle Grant to Brock as part of contract negotiation.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, exactly. So
and that she was supposed to have sex with Brock, but Brock got too drunk or something like that.
Yeah. So I think people need to look at that. I'm not saying I know anything specifically, but I think it needs to be considered that based on the things we know, he is potentially one of the best government witnesses if he were to feel he needed to save himself, especially, or if they gave him immunity or compelled him to testify in some way.
He's hiding somewhere in Saskatchewan if you can track him down.
When is he not?
Well, and I guess that was kind of eye-opening in the sense of I assumed Brock was going to come back to the company, and he still might, but I think they were kind of waiting on the things to blow over, and I felt like this might have reset that clock a little bit.
Yes.
And if this is a company that wants to wipe its hand at Vince, doesn't want to talk about the Janelle Grant lawsuit at all, it seems like a really unnecessary risk to bring Lesnar back to the company, even though he probably holds a decent amount of value in terms of people would be interested in seeing him as a performer.
Yes, but it's also a time where they don't need him.
Yeah,
so
but if
as long as they're hot, yeah.
If those houses start going a little bit soft, or because that's when I assume he would come back anyway, which is yeah, we don't need him. Why would we? But
yes.
If stuff changes and eventually they're going to cool off, and they need a big star to bring in to help jolt things, Brock will be there waiting. I'm sure he'll want to be paid handsomely to do it, but this it was interesting to me that they went after essentially I don't know, I guess an active WWE wrestler, or at least someone that's wrestled, because outside of Vince himself, there's nothing on any like wrestler that has wrestled for this company in the last like 20 years for the most part.
Yeah.
You know, we can talk about Jimmy Snuka, we can talk about Hulk Hogan, we can talk about even Steve Austin denying CTE. There's really nothing, any scandals or anything connected to it. I guess they talk about Benoit,
Yes.
but obviously Benoit's not going to come back and wrestle for them. So
Yes. One thing I felt that the documentary did surprisingly well, and honestly, I think was one of the strongest segments of the documentary, was when they get into the idea of Vince taking allegations against him and then putting his version in a storyline. Like, I thought that was very well done, where they mention the tanning salon, sexual assault allegation, and talk about how a few weeks later, and they show the footage, is the angle where Mickey James comes on to Trish Stratus's boyfriend, he rebuffs her, and then she starts screaming that he, was sexually assaulting. Like, they do that. They talk about they don't bring up specifically that Ashley Massaro said that this was basically a duplicate of a specific thing that happened in real life, but they show the angle where she spills coffee on Vince and he starts yelling at her and berating at her and saying, "Oh, are you gonna cry? Are you gonna cry?" That's kind of disturbing to watch. So I forget if they used any other examples, but I thought they did a good job, like, showing this is a thing that he did. It's fairly damning in the context. I mean, there's even more they could have mentioned. There's the Melina Batista thing, where she comes on to him to try to give up a match. I think it was a Batista and Rey Mysterio like title shot against Eminem or something like that. And she comes on to him. They have sex off camera. We come back at post-coital as they're getting dressed, and he brushes her off like, "No, I'm not canceling the match." And then the next week, she's suing him for quote unquote sexual harassment.
mm-hmm.
That came not long after the thing with the $7.5 million settlement for the Coerced Sex Act.
I mean, you could do a whole documentary just on the way women are represented on Vince's television.
Yes.
And all of the weird quirks, like a hallmark of Vince's creative, right, is that a couple, like a married couple or relationship couple that gets along really well, are always heels. They're always some sort of evil heel where the woman helps the guy cheat or something like that. They're always represented negatively.
Okay, that's interesting. I've never really thought about that before. Basically, what you're saying is there are no happy babyface couples.
They're very rare, or if they do, they eventually like kind of fade away. But like, think about like on-screen couples, right? It's like Triple H and Stephanie, right? They're like evil, conniving power couples.
And you're limiting this to people who are real life couples as well, or any on-screen couple?
No, any on-screen couple. I feel like. I mean, I'm sure you can point to examples throughout wrestling, WWE history, where like, oh well, they were a couple and they got along. But
there aren't even that many babyface couples, period, when you really think about it.
Right.
And something that leads to, which I don't know what the best way to explore it would be, but like, they didn't get into, Vince's thing about, trying to break couples where he quote unquote didn't think the man was worthy. The one
that's another. Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm talking about. Like, it's another one, right? That like, if there was a guy who, wasn't built like a 6'5" bodybuilder and he had like a super attractive wife, he always tried to like humiliate that person. And that was like an old boys club backstage kind of thing, right? That they would,
and the one we've heard the most about, I guess, is Miro and CJ, which is also just bizarre because like Miro is a very conventionally handsome man, like he is, but seemingly because he's a brown-skinned foreigner,
I was gonna say he's foreign, Dix. Have you considered that?
Yes, like he's not worthy of CJ.
Well, they did the whole. Remember they did. Didn't they do something relatively recently with like what's Rockstar Spud's name in a WWE?
Drake Maverick.
Drake Maverick. Yeah, they did like stuff with him and his wife because he has a very conventionally attractive wife, and he is exactly the kind of guy that Vince and company.
Oh, right. Okay, yes. Where like look, Spud did a very good job with the comedy of it, but yes, there was a running thing that he had yet to consummate his marriage.
Right, and that is the classic, like, and you just, for those who know, like you said, like, it's kind of weird with Miro and CJ because Miro looks a certain way, but Drake Maverick is the exact kind of guy that that Vince and
He's
Kevin
very
Dunn threw out.
tiny. Yes.
Yeah. How did he get a girl like that? Like,
Yes.
that kind of bullshit. I mean, the other thing, like the constant, the way women and men are portrayed in WWE in terms of like the consistent angle that if like a woman is who's really hot, which is most of the people in WWE, like the men just have no control over and can be so easily manipulated by them is like a running trend.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
know
And
wrestlers have
go ahead.
said this. I think it was like I don't know, it might have been in Mox's book, I want to say, but it was someone wrote about it essentially like arguing, being like, I'm like the world champion guy. Like I shouldn't be like just falling head over heels because I see a hot woman. Like they should be falling head over heels for me because I'm the big star. And Vince is like, no, you don't get it. She's so hot. Like it's just so much going on
I
there with just
really
the
need
on
to read
screen.
Mox's book. I don't know why I still haven't. I
That
really
might
need
not
to.
be it. That might not be in Monk's book. It might be
But
somewhere else.
it sounds like something he would say
I know.
though.
It
To a
obviously
degree.
does. But it's one of those things that like a constant, and if you can throughout WWE history, you can see it's like guys who are supposed to be big stars they have no control. They're like cavemen. Um, and that's just I think that all goes to the way views women, Vince's
Yes.
relationships with women, and uh, none of that is really explored in this documentary. But I think is ultimately like not to get all Freudian, but it's like a key facet in how he functions.
Yes. Something that I think we've talked about a little on Between the Sheets, and that my co-host Chris Elner pointed out on Twitter, and that comes up some on the show that, as you and I are recording this, is about to come out, covering 2006 with the Kai guest. Chris mentioned something that, it's twofold. We had talked before about how, and he said this on Twitter too, like the quote unquote ruthless aggression era really is much worse for portrayal of women, both in Vince's direct storyline orbit and outside of it, than the quote unquote attitude era was. Like say what you will, and Kaya, I think, chimed in with this point too. Like, say what you will about the attitude era, most of the women's storylines are about titles and belts and basic wrestling feuds and whatnot. In the 2000s, like especially like the early to mid 2000s, quote unquote, ruthless aggression period, it's a lot more bitches be crazy kind of storylines. And like, I sort of have this theory that people have just a collective amnesia about, let's call it like 2003 to 2006 or so WWE, because the product's so bad, and also like there was a lot of just stuff in general that ran together. But between the product and also what was being reported in the newsletters, there's just so much damning shit. Like you watch the TV, it's like anytime we watch something from that era, there is always like there's always some kind of really gross angle, especially with the hindsight of the lawsuit. We did one like a month or two back where like in the same week you had the Kurt Angle Charmel thing, the Kane Lita thing, and the Viscera stuff with Lillian Garcia and everything that surrounded it. All in 1 week of TV.
Yeah, and I definitely think because the Attitude Era has been so glamorized in a way that the ruthless aggression era hasn't been. I think there's been more focus on the way like women are presented in the Attitude Era. But you're 100% right. I mean, that was the era of WWE I grew up with. I mean,
Yeah.
was how women were portrayed, and it probably. When do you think that like
What was the
stopped,
catalyst?
or
Or
at least
when did it stop?
was it the shift to PG?
I think that's some of it, maybe. I think the catalyst for it happening was the stuff that, was in the newsletters at the time about Vince losing his mind when he was turning 60. Um, and also just the no competition and brazenness from other
Well, you
things
needed
that were happening.
stars, and when you need stars, you start taking tricks, and one of the tricks to just do that is let's throw sex on TV.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Is for when really they started to tone things down, even if the portrayal of women wasn't good. Yeah, I would say the toning down is PG.
And even in that era, we still had the things like the making fun of Mickey James because she's fat, like all this other stuff that
Which
was still demeaning.
okay, I don't know if you ever heard me tell this anecdote. Okay. I mean, the Mickey James thing is ridiculous regardless, but there's a reason it's extra ridiculous. Um, trying to remember which website I was writing for at the time. Maybe I think it was either Bleacher Report or Cage Side Seats. I'd be looking for photos for articles and stuff.
Mhm.
So I go into Google Images, and when I would search for a Mickey James story, I would search for Mickey James images. There would always be a bunch of results from, like websites with pictures of her in relative states of undress that always described her and her WWE era shape, not when she was skinnier on the indies or anything. And when I say skinnier, I mean relatively speaking, obviously.
Mhm.
They all called her like hot fitness babe Mickey James. Like, to the average person watching that show, like, not only was she not fat, but she was, to most people watching the show, probably more attractive to most of the viewers than the other women.
I can tell you right now, she's very attractive to 14-year-old Jesse Collings.
Yeah, so like that was just extra insane, and like they do the thing where it's like, oh, it's heels saying it, so you can argue, oh, the heels were technically lying, and they did that with other stuff at times, sometimes in more nefarious ways. But also there is all the Vicky Guerrero
I was gonna say that's
shit,
like right around the same time period where it was like for years, like
and
there was
that's
just this,
all post PG.
right.
I mean, a lot of it is PG era.
This is like
Uh,
2012 ish. I feel like,
yeah, AJ Lee's whole character was bitches be crazy.
right, and she could manipulate those dumb wrestlers with her good
Yes,
looks.
exactly, and yeah, there's that. I feel like I'm forgetting more. I mean, one thing I wanted to mention too that this is where it was going earlier. I don't know if there's a good way, to do like I said, like the stuff about breaking couples up, which also I found it very interesting that more places didn't pick up on what Mercedes Moné said about that recently, and that they kind of buried that lead beneath just her general comments about her divorce. But um, there's that, but there's also like, especially in that ruthless aggression era, there are times on TV, certain moments, and then certain like patterns of people repeatedly interacting where I can't describe it, but you know it when you see it. It feels fairly obvious that it's Vince trying to get two people to hook up. There is just a tone and a style to the content and the degree to which certain things are being sexualized where it feels like that is his end game. And I feel like I'll say this because it's the example like where we've talked about it most on Between the Sheets when it's come up. You watch like when Maria is interviewing John Cena, it comes off like Vince is trying to make something happen. Was he? I have no idea, but it comes off that way.
Just Vince, like I would agree with that just because it's in line with what Vince's idea, like Vince's attitude towards everything, which is that especially in terms of his wrestlers and his
Yes, the hot
um
girls are for the top stars in the office.
well, and just in general, like he wants to wield complete control and authority over them, and so that means
Yes.
I like if I want to be a play matchmaker, then I can do that. And
Yes,
honestly,
yes, exactly.
at that stage of his career and that stage of his life, I don't know how much of that is him. This is just who he is, and it's almost like instinctual. That's what he does as a pattern and learned behavior, as opposed to him like really consciously thinking about it all that much.
I uh, I don't know if I would agree with that, but I get your point. But it absolutely, it's how he sees things, and it's exerting control. And it also goes to like stuff like, but just as far as like the whole thing of like, oh, hot girls should be with top guys thing. There's the story, which until recently I'd forgotten was actually in the Observer. And whatever you want to say about Dave, like this is something I heard at the time too from wrestlers who were there. When Alicia Fox and Kelly signed, straight out of a Bikini Catalog by John Laurinaitis, which is a whole other thing. The guys in OVW were told, do not fraternize with either of them, or there will be repercussions. And the rumor was, and what ended up in the Observer, was that Mikey Batts had a consensual fling with one of them and got fired. I reached out to him at one point, and he didn't deny it. And like, even if you want to think about age or whatever, he was like 21 or 22 or something. And both of the women were 19, so it was not even like an inappropriate age gap.
What you're saying is you're saying that maybe it was implied that they were
earmarked. Yes. Yeah. Yes, exactly. And and not in a way that reflects on either woman, obviously, without their knowledge or consent, surely. So that you have stuff like that. And then there's even shit now. And I've said this elsewhere, and I think it's important to mention, as far as circling back to today and the post-Vince WWE. It was a few years ago that they had multiple female coaches at one point. I think the most they had at the same time was 3.
Yeah.
Which was Sarah Amato, Serena Deeb, and Sarah Stock.
Mm-hmm.
Deeb and Stock got let go in the pandemic cuts. Deeb got, signed up pretty quickly by AEW as talent. It was within months. It was before the end of 2020, I believe. And but Stock just sat on the sidelines for a few years. It was quite a long time before AEW signed her as a producer. And then Sarah Amato, Sarah Del Rey, for those who don't know, she goes on maternity leave almost 3 years ago now. And I think I'm remembering it right. I think it's 3 years, not 2. And around that time, I've never asked this specifically, but I assume it was tied to it. After a long time and telling her they were waiting for budget approval and stuff, they signed Allison Danger as coach. And for those who don't know, like, everyone that's been around her and has learned from her when she would agent at Shimmer, more recently at Catalyst Wrestling, and just been around her at shows, like, she is considered just a great mind as a coach and producer and everything, with constructive criticism and everything. I mean, you hear the same thing about basically the entire Carino family and their wrestling brains and how they treat people. They're pretty beloved. 3 months. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I'll tell you right now, I have written about this, so people aren't going to be surprised when I say this. Like, I think that there are elements of the Janelle Grant lawsuit that have appeared on WWE television.
Well, we'll get to that in a second. But what I was saying though is, Allison Danger was fired like 3-4 months after she was hired.
Right when she moved down to Florida, right?
Yeah, uprooted her whole family to Florida from Vegas. Told it was due to budget cuts, even though she had been told for at least months, if not longer, before she was hired, that they were wanting to hire her, but looking for budget approval to hire her. So it was bullshit. And Sarah Amato, once she came back from maternity leave, and people have read it this way when I've tweeted about this, and I don't know why. I'm not saying this as a criticism to her or anything. Whatever Sarah Amato's job is now, she is no longer working full-time hours as a coach. She maybe works 10 hours a week at most as a coach. Aside from that, I've never heard anyone find out what she does the rest of the week. If she's doing other office stuff for WWE, or she's only part-time now, whatever. Despite that being going on now for years, they have never filled that full-time female coach role at a time where they're hiring so many younger, like college age and just out of college women.
Many of
And
whom have no prior pro wrestling experience at all.
yes, and to me, it's pretty glaring. Like, why are you not filling that role, especially when we know there are people, or there were people available that you felt were appropriate for that role, and in spite of, since I believe it's Matt Bloom as head coach that has the ability to choose the guest coaches. And despite Matt Bloom having her back multiple times as a guest coach, like Allison Dager's never been rehired back, even if it was some kind of Vince and Laurinaitis thing, which I think is possible, she was never brought back after they were gone, and no one else has been brought in. And to me, it's like, you have all these very young women, many who do not have prior wrestling backgrounds coming in, and you have no female like coaches or authority figures for them to learn from, relate to, be able to confide in and trust, etc. Like, to me, that feels deliberate and sinister.
Well, Phil Brooks is down there.
I don't want to get too much into
Sorry.
that.
I
I
had to,
mean, I
thinking
get where some
confiding
people are coming from on it, but it's not the same thing.
No, I know what you mean. And we're
I
not
get why you
talking
cracked
like
the joke, though. But yes.
you're talking about like the lack of like this is would exist not just in wrestling, but in any company. You have a huge company. You hire a bunch of young women. You want to have other women in positions of authority that they can trust and rely on. That is what almost any big
especially
company,
in a coaching role, in
right,
athletics,
in a
and
male-dominated industry.
yes, and there's no answer to that. And they kind of lied about it. Someone asked Shawn Michaels about it on one of the NXT calls within the last year. I think it was in 2024. I forget his exact answer. It seemed like he was aware that it was out there, because I think I'm the only person that's mentioned this, but like, he was like, "Oh, she's so low key that people don't even notice she's here," which felt like such a crafted answer about Sarah Amato. Like, there's something going on there. Like, there's other shit I've heard that makes me think there's more to it, which I shouldn't get into here, but like, I'm sorry, that's a huge red flag to me. And that's something that's still going on under Paul Levesque's WWE, without Vince McMahon, without John Laurinaitis.
Well, yeah, I mean, they didn't mention Bill DeMott. They didn't mention Velveteen Dream, Patrick Clark.
I mean, not all of that is necessarily germane to a Vince documentary.
Well, it's not, but in terms of just like, if I was doing the documentary and I'd be like, this is the culture that Vince created, even though Vince may be gone, or in areas where Vince really didn't exercise a ton of control, there was still, a lack of accountability for things that were going on.
Yes, and people forget, by the way, with Velveteen Dream, he was fired a year after all those allegations. Like,
oh yeah,
it wasn't right away. It seems like they did deliberately fire him for cause over something, because it was like separated out from the group of releases around that time.
Well, his push, if I recall correctly, his push really stopped too. Before he was fired. Like, he was kind of like, I think he was kind of like pretty close to the main roster in terms of like his progress, in terms of how over he was getting and how he was being presented on NXT television. And then there was like a whole year where he was there where he really didn't do a whole lot.
Well, and something that blew my mind, that both that it happened and that for some reason no one else really picked up on it. There was I forget which, if it was Keith Lee vacating or whatever. There was some ladder match for the vacant North American title that he was in after the allegations, after presumably the story EC3 tells of him seemingly trying to record guys going to the bathroom. Every time, and this was during the pandemic, I should be clear, when it was Performance Center trainees and maybe also local indie wrestlers as the crowd. And every time he's on offense, anytime he's doing something that would get a pop, anything, it is obvious that everyone in that crowd that works there is deliberately being dead silence in protest. They are not reacting at all like they are to the rest of the match or anything else that's going on that card or period at that time. Like clearly everyone there did not like him at all, and for some serious reasons, to the point they would just completely disrupt a show like that. So yeah, like there is a larger context you can talk about that. Like, and again, this is not a specific Vince thing, but if we're going to the culture, like they're handling a speaking out where everyone who admitted to wrongdoing got fired. Nobody who didn't got, not regardless what evidence there was or wasn't, nothing happened to anyone who didn't admit wrongdoing. Joe Coffey was suspended for reasons that were never explained, that he was the only one that was suspended, but other than that, there's that. There's plenty you could talk about. Just, I guess to bring this home, it's such a flawed documentary. It's not a hit piece. It's not fluff. It's not, or I should say, it's not a puff piece, but it's in the middle in the wrong way. It has all of the problems that a puff piece would have. And it's, Meltzer was right when he said he didn't think that people's expectations, whether they liked Vince or hated him, he didn't think either side would be happy. And I think he was right.
All right. I want to thank David Bixenspan for being on the show. David, do you have anything you want to plug or anything else?
Yeah, main thing I'll plug is Between the Sheets, my podcast with Chris Zellner that I alluded to earlier. You can find it, wherever you can find podcasts. We cover a week in history. We jump around through different years, always at least 10 years ago.
Well, and I want to point out that's a very wise gimmick, because then you're really giving yourself, it was a really smart decision on your
part. To not do like a just chronological, yes.
Yeah.
Because then it gets repetitive too, because there's stuff that's layering on each other, especially as a weekly show. Yeah. So, we jump around a week as it was covered in the newsletters with clips from the TV shows and stuff. And, we kind of analyze both what happened and the coverage. And, it does get fairly inside baseball at times. And then we have our Patreon, patreon.com/between the sheets, where it's a single topic deep dive is the bonus content each month. We, it's a long form podcast, and we do a single, we guarantee you at least one single long, single topic show each month. And we've done 8 years of that now. We're getting close to 100 Patreon shows. And, we've done a lot of Paul Heyman and Eddie Gilbert stuff. We did a series on the Titan Gate scandals from '92, which we did make available for free if people want to hear that. After the Janelle Grant lawsuit, we both wanted people to listen, but we didn't want to feel like we were pushing people to spend money on us as a direct consequence of the lawsuit news. So we decided, let's just make it free. So all 4 parts of that are free. There are other free shows up that if you go to the Patreon, there is a free shows collection. We, depending on when you release this, we've either finished both parts of or about to post the second part of our Chris Jericho leaving WCW for WWF series. Recently we did a 3-part series on Rob Feinstein's ouster from Ring of Honor. All that's just scratching the surface. We did 4 shows about the sale of WCW, first the Fusion stuff, and then we went back in time to all the sale talks in terms of WWF and other parties in 2000. One-off shows. We did a show about Sid going from WCW to WWF. We did multiple shows about Global Wrestling Federation or Abrams EWF. We did some shows I personally really love about another startup, John Collins, MECW, where Bo James joined us because he was actually involved with some of that and had a lot of insight. There's just a ton there, and it's, for the bonus shows, it's $5 tier a month or higher. If you want to do the annual subscription, it's 16% off. So that's 40, I should say, a year for that. And then, we have higher tiers if people want to be able to pick episode topics for the main show, weeks and stuff like that. So that's patreon.com/between the sheets. I do also have a Substack, babyfacebehealed.com, which I may change the name soon. If I do, it'll redirect, but I've become more aware that the guy who freaked out about pronouns in that video game goes by heel versus babyface.
Tough.
And so I had been thinking of changing the name anyway to something that's maybe just more my brand or something more generic. Like I realized babyface v heel instead of babyface versus heels also got a little hanky. So I may change that soon. It'll redirect if I do it. But I have some stuff there. Most of the stuff is not paywall, mainly just pay if you want to support me. But I try to throw stuff on there when I don't really have anywhere else to put it. So people can check that out if they want. And yeah, those are the main plugs, wrestling wise. I don't think I have anything else to plug right now. Thankfully, honestly, like, even though I do other, I have the podcast and other stuff on the side, like, I think it was needed to not make my living on, like, the main part of my living on wrestling related stuff anymore. Since, my main job now is writing about tech stuff for Slash Gear, and I think that was for the best for my
that route has never appealed to me, like doing this full time.
I mean, it just kind of happened, and even then, for a decent stretch of that, I was writing more about other, not more than wrestling, but other things too. But just it was needed to get me just out of that space and like to be able to have it as more of a just fandom and side hustle thing. I think again. So
all right. I want to thank Bix for being on the show. I want to thank all our listeners, and we'll talk to you again. See you later.
Hello, do you like New Japan Pro Wrestling? Are you a Shin Nihon freak? If so, check out the Super J-Cast with Joel and Damon on the Voices of Wrestling podcast network.
And even if you fucking hate New Japan Pro Wrestling, listen to the Super J-Cast anyway. Not just for our great show reviews, analysis, and pastrami sandwiches, but there's also usually some dick jokes somewhere in the obligatory opening 30 minutes of absolute nonsense we chat about every single week. That's the Super J-Cast for all the best talk about New Japan Pro Wrestling, crisps, and pornography.